The portraits lied. On canvases that still hang in Madrid, Vienna, and Prague, the royal family of Spain stares down at us in oils and varnish, handsome kings, beautiful queens, noble princes and princesses. Their garments are woven with gold, their faces serene, their postures perfect. But behind those painted masks hid a truth so grotesque, so unnatural, that no brush could ever capture it. On November 6, 1661, Queen Mariana of Austria gave birth to her long-awaited son. He was to be Charles, heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, master of lands stretching from the silver mines of the New World to the palaces of Madrid, Naples, and Brussels. Bells rang across Spain, priests gave thanks, and the court rejoiced. But in the Queen's chamber, the celebration curdled into horror. For when the midwives placed the child in his mother's arms, Mariana recoiled. This was no healthy prince. His head was grotesquely large and misshapen, his jaw jutted forward like a grotesque caricature of his ancestors, and his tiny body trembled with weakness. What you're about to discover is far darker than anything the portraits dared to reveal. Before we get into this, tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe to the video, like and comment your city below because this is just the beginning of the hidden truths behind Europe's most cursed thrones. Now, let's rewind to how this moment started. What you're about to discover is far darker than anything the portraits dared to reveal. Before we get into this, tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe to the video, like and comment your city below because this is just the beginning of the hidden truths behind Europe's most cursed thrones. Now, let's rewind to how this moment started. For when the midwives placed the child in his mother's arms, Mariana recoiled. This was no healthy prince. His head was grotesquely large and misshapen, his jaw jutted forward like a grotesque caricature of his ancestors, and his tiny body trembled with weakness. The infant cried, but the sound was not the cry of life. It was the rasp of fragility. The boy who was supposed to embody the strength of Spain was instead the embodiment of centuries of a dynasty poisoning itself in the name of bloodline. Charles would survive, barely, but his body was never his own. His skull was swollen with fluid, his tongue so oversized that it filled his mouth, making nursing nearly impossible. Servants spoon-fed him like an invalid. His jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw that had plagued his family for generations, was so deformed that he could neither chew food properly nor speak clearly. His mother whispered her shame in secret, and foreign ambassadors recorded with astonishment that the infant heir looked more like a malformed puppet than a child. The court doctors were baffled, but none dared speak the truth aloud. The truth was written in the family tree, where uncle married niece, cousin married cousin, and marriages were celebrated less for love than for the preservation of pure blood. The Spanish Habsburgs had carried this obsession for generations, believing their divine power rested in their lineage. What they did not know, or refused to acknowledge, was that their so-called purity was their undoing. The genealogy of Charles II was less a tree than a knot. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had married his own niece, Mariana. His grandmother on one side was also his aunt on the other. The further back one traced, the more tangled it became, until it was almost impossible to distinguish uncle from brother, cousin from father. By the time Charles was born, his genetic coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born from brother-sister incest. Spain had gambled everything on bloodlines, and now the heir of that empire was born broken. The world outside the palace walls did not know the truth. Bells still rang, poets still wrote odes, and priests still proclaimed the child a blessing from God. Spain, after all, was still a colossus. Its fleets carried silver across the Atlantic, its armies marched in Europe, its wealth funded wars and cathedrals alike. But beneath the gold and glory, cracks spread like veins in marble. Because Charles was not only an heir, he was a warning. As he grew, the symptoms only worsened. At 4 years old, he still could not walk. He drooled constantly, unable to control his mouth. He spoke only in broken sounds, his words slurred and incomprehensible. His limbs were weak and twisted, his chest narrow, his bones brittle. He was the king's son, the hope of the dynasty, yet he appeared less like a prince and more like a victim of some ancient curse. And indeed, many whispered that he was cursed. Priests spoke of divine punishment for Spain's pride. Astrologers claimed the stars had doomed him. Ordinary citizens called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But the truth was not supernatural. It was science, written in the chromosomes his ancestors had shattered. Charles II of Spain was not simply a sickly child. He was the final product of a dynasty that had confused purity with strength, and in doing so, destroyed itself from within. Even as a child, he was carried into public like a relic rather than a boy. Court painters, commanded to flatter their subjects, softened his deformities on canvas, tilting his head at angles that hid the worst of his jaw, draping him in garments that disguised his frailty. The people of Spain, who saw their king mostly in portraits and ceremonies, could believe in the illusion of majesty. But those closest to him knew the truth, that their prince was already a dying man. His mother prayed desperately for a miracle, but she also ruled his every movement. Mariana sheltered him obsessively, fearing that even a common cold would kill him. But her protection could not hide the obvious. Charles could not run, could not play, could not learn as other boys did. He was heir to an empire, yet already a prisoner of his own body. The portraits lied, but history does not. The tragedy of Charles II did not begin with his birth. It began generations earlier, with a dynasty that mistook purity for power. The Habsburgs believed their bloodline was sacred, chosen by God to rule not just Spain, but much of Europe. They ruled Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Spain's vast colonial empire. Their motto was simple: let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did, but always within the family. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and alliances that might have brought fresh blood from outside were instead refused. For the Habsburgs, keeping it in the family was not a joke, it was state policy. To mix with outsiders was to dilute divine blood. To marry within was to preserve it. But blood is not strengthened by repetition. It is weakened. Genes that might have lain dormant in separate families began to combine, repeat, and mutate. Deformities that should have been rare became common. Weaknesses that might have disappeared became dominant. The Habsburg obsession with purity planted the seeds of their own ruin. Nowhere was this more visible than in their infamous jaw. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, was a grotesque enlargement of the lower jaw that jutted forward, making chewing and speaking difficult. Portraits softened it, but travelers and diplomats described it bluntly. The kings of Spain often looked like caricatures, their faces collapsing under the weight of their deformities. But the jaw was only the surface. The deeper effects of inbreeding were far worse. Children were still born in alarming numbers. Those who survived were frail, sickly, prone to seizures and disease. Many never reached adulthood. And those who did often struggled with infertility, ensuring the dynasty's survival depended on fewer and fewer heirs. Charles II embodied the culmination of this centuries-long gamble. Modern geneticists have studied his family tree and calculated that his inbreeding coefficient was astonishing, 0.254. To put this into perspective, if a child is born from the union of siblings, their coefficient is 0.25. Charles was genetically more inbred than the child of brother and sister. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. That meant Charles's mother was both his cousin and his aunt. His grandmother on one side was also his aunt on the other. Tracing the family tree becomes less like reading history and more like reading a circle that collapses in on itself. The results were catastrophic. Charles inherited not just the jaw but hydrocephalus, water on the brain, rickets, epilepsy, and infertility. His body was a map of genetic failure, and yet he was expected to embody the might of an empire. Ambassadors at the Spanish court could not ignore the irony. One Venetian wrote, "The Catholic king is always an invalid. His body is as weak as his kingdom is vast." Foreign courts whispered that Spain was being ruled by a dynasty of ghosts. But within Madrid, the truth could never be spoken aloud. To question the purity of the royal blood was treason. Instead, the court dressed the problem in ritual. Painters were instructed to glorify Charles's image, to soften his deformities, to present him as divine. Priests declared his suffering proof of holiness, as though God had chosen him to bear physical weakness as a spiritual cross. Ministers assured the people that miracles would follow. But miracles never came. The inbreeding did not only shape Charles, it shaped the empire. Because the dynasty was so obsessed with its own blood, it neglected alliances that might have preserved Spain's power. Where other nations married for strategy, Spain married for purity. And so, while their colonies in the Americas filled their treasuries with silver, their armies bled in endless wars. France, England, and the Dutch Republic grew stronger, while Spain weakened, trapped in a cage of its own making. The people did not see the mathematics of genetics, but they felt its consequences. They saw a king who could not stand without support, who drooled on ceremonial garments, who spoke with a slur, who collapsed into seizures before foreign ambassadors. They saw noblewomen forced into barren marriages with a man who could not consummate them. They saw their empire losing ground abroad while their monarch could barely feed himself. And yet, within the court, no one dared speak the simple truth: the dynasty had destroyed itself. Instead, they whispered of curses, witchcraft, demons, and enchantments. Charles became known not as the inbred king, but as El Hechizado, the bewitched. The label was easier, more comforting, than admitting the real cause: centuries of Habsburgs marrying themselves. Even today, the family tree of the Spanish Habsburgs is studied in classrooms as a case study in genetic collapse. Students trace the lines of descent and watch them knot together, over and over, until the end of the dynasty was inevitable. It is a warning written in blood, that arrogance can undo even the mightiest empire. And in 1661, that warning took the shape of a child whose head was too large for his body, whose jaw jutted grotesquely, whose tongue was too big for his mouth, whose very existence was proof that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, could escape the laws of biology. The Habsburgs had mistaken purity for strength. What they had created instead was fragility. And Charles II was both the symbol and the victim of their obsession. But the most tragic part of this story is not just the arrogance of kings. It is the silence of those who saw the truth and refused to speak it. Priests hid it behind superstition, ministers hid it behind ceremony, and the people hid it behind fear. Their silence allowed the illusion of strength to stand, even as their king collapsed. And that's why telling this story matters. Because silence is complicated. The more we ignore history's warnings, the more likely we are to repeat them. If you've listened this far, you are already breaking that silence. You are doing what those courtiers never did, facing the truth head-on. Spain paid the price for its silence. We don't have to. But what did that silence mean for Charles himself? What did it look like to grow up as a boy who could not walk, could not speak, could not even chew his food, yet was told he was chosen by God to rule an empire? Charles II's earliest years were marked not by the joys of childhood but by constant reminders of his fragility. While other princes were taught to ride ponies and recite Latin verses, Charles was carried in the arms of servants, his limbs too weak to bear his weight. His head was grotesquely large compared to his frail body, and he drooled constantly, unable to control the muscles of his mouth. By the age of 4, Charles could not yet walk. He could not speak more than a handful of slurred, broken words. He spent his days strapped into chairs so he would not topple forward, his oversized tongue protruding from his mouth. When foreign ambassadors came to Madrid, they were horrified at the sight of Spain's heir. One French observer wrote, "He is more a creature than a prince, incapable of the simplest expressions of humanity." The Habsburg court, desperate to conceal his condition, ordered painters to disguise the truth. Portraits of Charles as a child show him dressed in magnificent robes, with wigs that softened the disproportion of his head, and poses that minimized the jut of his jaw. In paint, he was every inch a royal prince. In life, he was a boy who could barely swallow his food. His meals were spectacles of humiliation. Servants spoon-fed him broth and soft bread soaked in wine because he could not chew solid food. His tongue filled his mouth so completely that swallowing was often a battle. He choked, sputtered, and dribbled food down the front of his embroidered garments. What should have been routine nourishment became a performance of weakness that no ceremony could disguise. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, was both fiercely protective and secretly ashamed. She sheltered Charles obsessively, fearing even a slight illness would kill him. Yet in her private writings, she admitted despair at his deformities. A child meant to secure her dynasty instead embodied its decay. Still, she clung to the belief that God had chosen him for greatness, even as physicians struggled to explain why the boy could not thrive. Physicians became fixtures in Charles's childhood. They bled him, purged him, and forced strange concoctions of herbs and minerals down his throat. Nothing helped. Some recommended he be surrounded with holy relics. Others prescribed pilgrimages and prayers. Whispered suggestions that his condition might be the result of inbreeding were never spoken in the Queen's presence. Instead, his weakness was explained as bewitchment, a curse placed upon Spain's royal house. Superstition flourished where medicine failed. Priests declared Charles bewitched by witches or demons. Exorcisms were attempted. Holy water was sprinkled over his bed, and relics of saints were laid upon his chest. Yet none of it gave him strength. The rituals only deepened his nickname among the people, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Despite his frailty, Charles was still heir to an empire. Tutors were brought in to educate him, but progress was painfully slow. He struggled to read even simple prayers, and his slurred speech made communication difficult. Frustrated tutors whispered that he had the mind of a child even as he grew older. His schooling became more ceremonial than practical, an illusion of learning rather than true preparation for kingship. Foreign visitors reported with increasing dismay on the prince's condition. In 1668, the Marquis of Villars, a French ambassador, described him bluntly, "The prince is so ugly as to cause fear, and he is incapable of either study or work." Another wrote, "It is impossible that he can live long, given his constitution." And yet Charles lived. Year after year, he survived illnesses that might have killed other children, his fragile body somehow clinging to life. This unnatural endurance only deepened the sense among courtiers that his existence was bound up with supernatural forces. If he was bewitched, then his survival was either a miracle or a curse. Meanwhile, Spain itself was faltering. The empire stretched across continents, but its resources were strained. Wars with France and rebellions in the Netherlands drained its treasury. Yet at the center of this vast realm was a boy who could barely walk unassisted, whose drooling and stammering made him a laughingstock in foreign courts. His body mirrored the empire itself, once mighty, now brittle, fragile, and collapsing under the weight of its own excesses. By adolescence, Charles could finally walk, but only with effort. His legs were thin, his posture bent, his steps unsteady. He relied heavily on attendants to guide him through ceremonies. His speech remained slurred and often incomprehensible. Court life revolved around disguising his inadequacies, inventing rituals and excuses that made weakness appear as sacred suffering. For the people of Spain, the truth was carefully hidden. They saw their prince only in portraits, parades, and ceremonies. He was presented as devout, humble, chosen by God to carry burdens that ordinary men could not. The image soothed their fears. The reality remained locked behind palace walls. But those who lived in the palace saw a different picture. They saw a boy who wept from constant headaches, who collapsed in seizures, who could not produce an heir for the dynasty that so desperately needed one. They saw the truth that no painting could conceal. Charles was not fit to be a king. Yet fate had given Spain no other choice. When Charles II reached adolescence, Spain waited anxiously to see if their broken prince would somehow transform into a king. Puberty was supposed to bring strength, manhood, fertility, proof that the dynasty could continue. Instead, it only confirmed the worst fears of his family and his people. Charles did not mature as other boys did. His voice remained high and weak, his beard refused to grow, and his body stayed frail and underdeveloped. While other young men of the court sparred in tournaments or paraded on horseback, Charles remained in his chambers, propped up by attendants, unable to participate in even the simplest exercises of masculinity. Whispers spread throughout Madrid. the king cannot be a man. And for a dynasty whose entire survival depended on producing heirs, that whisper was more dangerous than any rebellion. His first marriage was arranged in 1679, when Charles was 18. His bride was Marie-Louise of Orleans, the 17-year-old niece of Louis XIV of France. The marriage was celebrated with magnificent pageantry, as Spain hoped this union would strengthen ties with France and, more importantly, produce the long-awaited heir. But behind the closed doors of the royal bedchamber, humiliation awaited. Marie-Louise quickly discovered what Charles's attendants already knew: the king was incapable of consummation. His body, twisted by deformity and inbreeding, could not perform the simplest act of manhood. Doctors were summoned, remedies were prescribed, even magical rituals were attempted, but nothing worked. The queen, young and isolated in a foreign court, became the target of whispers and suspicion. Some accused her of witchcraft, others of frigidity. But the truth was clear: Charles could not father children. Spain's most powerful dynasty was facing extinction, and nothing could be done to prevent it. Desperation drove the court to extremes. Physicians ordered Charles to swallow potions made from exotic herbs, to bathe in hot springs, even to endure painful physical examinations. Priests recommended pilgrimages to shrines, where the king prayed for fertility. Nothing changed. Mariana, his mother, convinced that her son was bewitched, turned to darker measures. In 1690, an infamous ritual was performed. Charles was ordered to sleep beside the corpse of a saint, believing that proximity to holy remains might break the curse. He was laid upon the cold marble floor of a crypt, the air heavy with incense and decay, as priests chanted exorcisms. But the only thing the ritual achieved was to deepen the sense of dread surrounding the king. Foreign ambassadors began to write openly about his condition. The French ambassador reported, "The king's body is so weak and his mind so feeble that it is impossible for him to govern." Another wrote bluntly, "It is certain he cannot have children." The Spanish people, however, were told a different story. Official proclamations spoke of the king's piety, his humility, his endurance in the face of suffering. Painters continued to flatter him in portraits, presenting him as solemn, devout, and dignified. The illusion persisted, but in the palaces of Europe, no one was fooled. When Marie-Louise died in 1689, after years of childless marriage, rumors swirled. Some claimed she had been poisoned. Others believed she had simply wasted away under the pressure of her role. In truth, she likely died from illness, worsened by despair. Her death left Charles both widowed and heirless, with Spain's future hanging by a thread. A second marriage was arranged almost immediately, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess known for her family's fertility. If anyone could provide Spain with an heir, it would be her. But once again, the union proved fruitless. Charles remained infertile, and Maria Anna became another unwilling witness to the collapse of the Habsburg line. By now, Charles's body was failing rapidly. He suffered frequent seizures, his teeth rotted in his mouth, and his hair fell out in clumps. He grew paranoid, convinced that witches had cursed him. He ordered endless investigations into sorcery, and entire convents of women were accused of casting spells upon the king. Hundreds were tortured in futile attempts to find the source of his condition. Yet for all his suspicion of curses, the truth lay not in witchcraft but in the twisted mathematics of his bloodline. Charles II was not bewitched. He was the inevitable product of centuries of inbreeding. His body was not a battlefield between heaven and hell, but a victim of biology. Still, Spain clung to him. His existence, however fragile, was the only thread connecting the empire to legitimacy. Without him, a succession crisis loomed that could ignite all of Europe. And so the court dressed him in robes of gold, placed crowns upon his swollen head, and paraded him before the people as though he were a monarch of flesh and iron rather than bone and weakness. But behind the pageantry was a man broken not only in body but in spirit. Charles longed for strength he would never have. He longed for children he could never father. He longed to be a king, but he remained forever a boy, bewitched not by spells, but by the weight of his own blood. If this was the king who could not be a man, What would happen when his body finally began to collapse altogether, when seizures, hallucinations, and visions of death consumed the last Habsburg of Spain? By the time Charles II entered his 30s, Spain's king was a man already decades older in body. His face had become a mask of suffering, ashen skin stretched over a jaw that protruded like a caricature, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes. His teeth, what few remained, rotted black in his mouth. His hair, once long and dark, fell out in clumps, leaving his scalp patchy and pale. He often stumbled when walking, his legs weakened by rickets, and seizures struck without warning, shaking his body before horrified attendants. Foreign ambassadors who visited his court recorded their shock in grim detail. One Austrian envoy wrote, "The king is scarcely more than a shadow, more dead than alive, scarcely able to speak or move." Another, less restrained, declared, "He is a walking corpse." Charles himself was haunted by his condition. He believed, with growing certainty, that he had been cursed. Priests and exorcists surrounded him, whispering prayers, sprinkling holy water, and blaming witches for his endless weakness. Charles clung to these explanations because they were less terrifying than the truth, that his body was betraying him from within. Visions plagued him in the night. He claimed to see ghosts of dead Habsburg kings standing in his bedchamber, pointing at him with skeletal fingers, whispering that he was the last of the line. He saw demons lurking in the shadows, mocking him. He saw his dead wife, Marie-Louise, accusing him of failing to secure the dynasty. His paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, not even his second wife, Maria Anna. Meanwhile, the empire crumbled around him. Spain's once vast power was in decline. Wars with France drained its treasury, the Netherlands slipped away, and even the colonies in the Americas grew restless under mismanagement. The empire that had once terrified Europe was now a shell, held together by inertia and the illusion of past glory. Yet Charles still performed the rituals of kingship. He presided over ceremonies, his frail body draped in heavy robes that weighed him down like chains. He sat on the throne, his swollen head trembling, his watery eyes staring out at courtiers who applauded out of duty rather than respect. He was king in name, but in truth, he was a symbol, a reminder of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. Every hope that remained was tied to the possibility of an heir. Even as his health worsened, physicians and priests urged him to continue efforts with Maria Anna. Remedies grew more desperate. He was fed aphrodisiacs made from exotic plants, powdered animal bones, and even ground gemstones. Physicians bled him repeatedly, believing it might restore balance. Priests ordered him to drink holy water, to swallow oils mixed with wax from church candles, to wear amulets blessed by monks. Nothing worked. His body was too broken, his blood too poisoned. No child ever came. By his mid-30s, Charles could scarcely eat. His oversized jaw made chewing impossible, and his swollen tongue left him constantly drooling. He survived on soft foods, spoon-fed by servants as though he were still a child. Each meal was a reminder of his helplessness, each day a struggle against decay. Spain's ministers and nobles watched with growing dread. They knew that when Charles died, the question of succession would ignite Europe. Rival claimants from France and Austria circled like vultures, each eager to seize the Spanish crown. The king who could not walk unaided carried on his shoulders the fate of empires. In 1698, physicians warned that Charles was near death. His body, they said, was anatomically incapable of fathering children. He suffered constant headaches, fainting spells, and convulsions. His body swelled with fluid, his legs ulcerated, and his vision blurred. He was 37 years old, yet seemed like a man of 80. And yet, somehow, he endured another year. Each day he lived was another day of agony, another day of humiliation for Spain. Courtiers whispered that his suffering was divine punishment. Priests spoke of his body as a battlefield between heaven and hell. But in truth, it was simply the inevitable collapse of centuries of inbreeding. By 1700, Charles was finished. He spent his final weeks bedridden, barely conscious, drifting in and out of fevers and visions. He died on November 1st, All Saints' Day, at the age of 38. The people mourned, but the empire trembled, for with his death, the Habsburg line of Spain was extinct. And here you are, still watching, still listening. That makes you something rare, a witness to truths that Spain itself tried to bury. Where courtiers lied, you have endured the raw, unvarnished reality. That makes you the hero of this story, because only by remembering can we honor the lessons of history. But if his life was a tragedy, what came after his death was revelation. Because when doctors cut open Charles II's body, what they found inside shocked even those who had watched him suffer in life. So let me ask you, what secrets does an autopsy reveal when the body on the table is the body of a dynasty? Charles II of Spain died on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1700. He was 38 years old, though his body had carried the weight of centuries of weakness. His death marked not only the end of a man, but the extinction of a dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. The kingdom mourned with processions and prayers, but behind closed doors, physicians prepared for one final duty, the autopsy. What they found within the body of the king shocked even those who had seen him suffer in life. Reports describe a corpse ravaged by unnatural decay. His body was emaciated, his skin waxen and pale. When the chest was opened, the heart was found to be the size of a peppercorn, shrunken, barely recognizable. His lungs were corroded, filled with fluid. His intestines were described as rotten, blackened with decay. His single remaining testicle was said to be shriveled and discolored, incapable of producing life. His head, when examined, was found to be filled with water, confirming suspicions of hydrocephalus. It was the anatomy of collapse, not just of a man, but of a dynasty. The autopsy confirmed what foreign ambassadors, physicians, and common people had whispered for decades. Charles II had been physically incapable of ruling, incapable of fathering children, incapable of continuing the line of Spain's Habsburgs. His body was not simply weak, it was evidence of centuries of self-destruction written into flesh and bone. Modern geneticists, centuries later, would study his family tree and confirm what the autopsy hinted at. Charles was the product of generations of inbreeding, his genes tangled and damaged beyond repair. He likely suffered from 2 rare genetic disorders simultaneously: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which explained his stunted growth and infertility, and distal renal tubular acidosis, which caused weakness, rickets, and deformities. No amount of prayer, ritual, or exorcism could have changed the outcome. His fate was sealed before he was even born. Spain, once the mightiest empire in the world, had gambled everything on the illusion of pure blood. That illusion had ended here, on a surgeon's table, with a body that was more ghost than king. The consequences were immediate and devastating. With no heir, the question of succession plunged Europe into chaos. Rival claimants from the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austrian Habsburgs prepared for war. The struggle to inherit Spain's empire ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that engulfed Europe for more than a decade. Tens of thousands would die, kingdoms would rise and fall, and borders would be redrawn, all because one man could not produce an heir. Thus, the story of Charles II is not merely a personal tragedy. It is a warning written in bloodlines and battlefields. It shows what happens when arrogance blinds rulers to the laws of nature, when obsession with purity becomes self-destruction, when silence allows weakness to masquerade as strength. And it reminds us that power, no matter how vast, cannot escape biology. In Madrid today, visitors to the royal palace can still see portraits of Charles II. At first glance, he appears regal, draped in finery, crowned with jewels, seated in grandeur. But look closer, and the truth reveals itself. The protruding jaw, the hollow cheeks, the weary eyes of a man who never truly lived. The brush could soften, but it could not erase. The canvas lied, but history does not. His story continues to fascinate because it is larger than one man. It is the story of a dynasty undone by its own choices, of an empire weakened by pride, of a people who wrapped their suffering king in prayers and portraits instead of facing the truth. It is also the story of silence, how generations refused to speak what they knew, until the silence itself became deadly. Charles II remains a figure of pity, not power. A king who ruled the richest empire on earth but was too frail to walk alone. A monarch who wore crowns of gold but could not chew bread. A man called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because it was easier to blame witches than admit that bloodlines had been poisoned by arrogance. And perhaps that is his greatest lesson, that history is not only shaped by the strong, but also destroyed by the fragile. That dynasties fall not only in battle, but in bedrooms and nurseries, when the pursuit of purity twists into a sentence of extinction. Charles II's body was a coffin for the Spanish Habsburgs. And when it was lowered into the earth, so too was buried the illusion that power and bloodline are stronger than truth. You've made it this far, and that makes you the true witness of this story. You've seen what Spain's courtiers refused to see, you've faced what portraits tried to hide, and you've carried a truth that kings themselves denied. That makes you the hero of this history. So don't let it end here. Like this video, subscribe, and send it to a friend, because the moment we stop telling these stories is the moment we risk repeating them. Spain's silence destroyed its dynasty. Your voice can keep its lesson alive. And now I leave you with one final question. If Charles II's body could bring down an empire, what hidden fragilities lie in our own time, waiting for silence to destroy them?